You're on final approach into a major airport. Visibility is under 600 feet. The runway doesn't exist yet, not to your eyes. The only thing telling the flight computer exactly how far above the ground you are is a small radar unit bouncing radio pulses off the Earth continuously in real time. That unit is the radio altimeter, autoland, automatic braking, terrain warnings. All of it depends on this one instrument being exactly right at the exact moment human eyes are useless. Now imagine that instrument receiving a signal it was never built to ignore. Not a fault inside the aircraft, a transmission from the ground, broadcasting a few hundred megahertz away, strong enough to overwhelm the receiver at the one moment the crew can least afford it. This isn't hypothetical. Regulators have logged hundreds of reports of exactly this interference. And 3 weeks before this video was made, an entire country's airspace lost a safety buffer it had relied on for years, triggering emergency directives overnight for some of the busiest aircraft fleets on Earth. Radio altimeters live in a narrow slice of spectrum, 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz. For decades, that band belonged to aviation and almost nobody else. Nothing powerful enough to matter sat nearby. Then wireless carriers went looking for mid-band spectrum wide enough to carry a 5G's data loads. The most valuable open real estate on the dial sat just below aviation's floor, 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz. The industry calls it the C-band. On paper, that's a gap of roughly 220 megahertz, a buffer. In practice, no filter is perfect, and no gap is truly empty. A powerful transmitter close to a runway can bleed energy across that gap, and an older altimeter, designed before anyone imagined a signal this strong, this close, can't always tell its own reflected pulse from someone else's noise. Aviation's own engineers saw this coming. In April 2020, the RTCA, the industry's technical standards body, ran the numbers and concluded there was a major risk. Strong C-band signals could interfere with radio altimeters on every category of aircraft, not just a fragile few. 3 failure paths make this real inside a cockpit. Overloaded receivers that lose track of the aircraft's own echo. Multipath reflections off buildings that fake an altitude that isn't real. And aging components that generate their own electrical noise once a strong signal hits them. The FCC auctioned that C-band spectrum in February 2021. Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile paid a combined $81 billion for the rights, the largest spectrum auction in American history. Airlines and pilot unions immediately called it a collision course with safety. By January 2022, the standoff had nearly grounded flights nationwide. Verizon and AT&T agreed to temporarily hold back full-power transmissions near airports while the FAA scrambled to measure the real danger. The fix that followed was triage, not a cure. Regional aircraft carrying the most vulnerable altimeters were ordered to install RF filters by the end of 2022. A wider rule, issued in 2023, set the baseline altimeter standard for the rest of the U.S. commercial fleet. Canada took a different route. In July 2023, its regulator built protection directly into the airspace, exclusion zones around runways, power limits on nearby towers, and antenna tilt restrictions angling 5G signals away from approach paths. For almost 3 years, that arrangement held. Not because the physics of interference had changed, but because regulators had built a fence around the problem instead of removing it. On July 1st of this year, that fence came down. Canada substantially reduced the exclusion zones, elevation masks, and tilt restrictions it had relied on since 2023, opening the door to stronger 5G signals much closer to its runways. The FAA didn't wait to find out what would happen next. It invoked emergency powers, skipped the normal public comment period, and issued a wave of directives covering the Boeing 737, 747, 757, 767, and 787 fleets, all effective the same day Canada's protections dropped. These directives don't ground anything. They do something quieter. They strip away the ability to fly the lowest visibility approaches and automatic landings in Canadian airspace. For any aircraft that can't prove it, tolerates the interference. The FAA's own language explains the urgency. Without reliable altimeter data, thrust reversers, spoilers, and speed brakes may not deploy correctly on landing. A normal landing distance quietly becomes a longer one, exactly when a crew has the least room to spare. Notice what actually triggered this, not a new mechanical flaw discovered inside the aircraft. A telecommunications policy change in a neighboring country. The airplane didn't get more dangerous overnight. The radio environment around it did. Here's what should worry frequent flyers even more. The fight so far has only been over the lower C-band. Regulators are now clearing the way for an upper C-band too. 3.98 to roughly 4.14 gigahertz, pressed directly against aviation's protected floor. Combined, the two bands form what regulators are now calling a 440 megahertz superband, stretching from 3.7 all the way to 4.14 gigahertz, one contiguous stretch of spectrum sitting right beneath aviation's last line of defense. In January 2026, the FAA proposed an entirely new round of altimeter standards, stating plainly that the equipment mandated back in 2023 will not be enough for what's coming. By August of 2025, the agency had already logged 659 reports of possible C-band interference, 493 of them tied directly to radio altimeters or related systems. Then, the same week, both sides moved at once. The FAA finalized a rule mandating hardened altimeters across the entire U.S. fleet, an estimated $4.49 billion retrofit, with a rebate program attached to speed compliance along. Days earlier, the FCC voted to auction another 160 megahertz of that upper C-band, 60% more than the legal minimum required of it, with the sale required to close by July 2027. Analysts expect it to raise tens of billions more. One regulator spent the week hardening aircraft against a threat. Another spent the same week selling more of the exact spectrum that creates it. Both are legally correct. Neither is finished. That tension is the whole story. This was never purely an aviation problem or purely a telecom problem. It's a spectrum problem. A finite public resource that two industries with opposing incentives are dividing 1 megahertz at a time. Every fence regulators have built, a filter, an exclusion zone, a power limit, has bought time, not solved the physics. Interference between adjacent bands doesn't disappear because a rule says operators must tolerate it. It disappears when the hardware underneath is actually replaced, and that fence keeps needing to be rebuilt. Lower C-band auctioned in 2021. Emergency retrofits in 2022. A domestic rule in 2023. Canada's protections built in 2023, dismantled in 2026. A nationwide mandate and a new spectrum auction, both finalized in the same week of July 2026. 6 years in, and the industry is still one policy memo away from another emergency directive. The next chapter is already scheduled. As carriers eye the upper C-band and look past it towards 6G, the same question returns. How close is too close when the answer has to be exactly right every single time for a plane full of people landing blind in the fog? If you found this documentary informative, please support our work by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know.